I always wish my wife could hear one of these introductions because I tell her I do really important stuff and it gets me nowhere right at home. But it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm super impressed, I have to say, with the focus on doing data for good. And I'm kind of even surprised that it popped out, because that's become a huge passion of mine right now. In the consortia I run, we're doing a massive program around well-being. And I can't tell you, the stresses that people are under today as a product of the collaborative intensity of the work, not just the volume, but the diversity of the demands that are coming to people. And it's affecting relationships, it's affecting physical health in unbelievable ways. So you'll see a whole suite of work on this coming out over the course of the next 18 months that I think is a really kind of interesting question to be thinking about, what we're doing to people. And so to get us started, I want everybody to stand up for me. And in the second day of the program, I want to get blood flowing and people kind of with me for a second. And I want you to get a number in your head. And what I'm going to ask you to think about is either for yourself or for the general person in your organization. Pick one or the other, I don't care which. But for yourself or that general individual, I want you to get a percentage of time that you spend each week in the following 3 activities altogether, okay? So a percent of time that you spend on the phone, on email, or in meetings, virtual or face-to-face. Phone, email, meetings, cumulatively, altogether in a typical week. All right, you got that number in your head? Okay, so if it's less than 20%, you can sit down at this point. Must be an academic. Yeah. Yeah. If it's less than 40%, you can sit down. 60%. You see some people going down now. 80%. General of the room, 100%. Usually some wise ass stays up, right? 101. So you get the idea. I've been doing this for 20 years. We've been at this, and I'll ask audiences of 800, 1,000, whatever, and generally the seats are happening at about 85%, right, roughly. And I can say that analytically when I look at the data and the explosion of the collaborative intensity of work. So given that, you have to ask yourself, how are you managing that time? Analytically, how are your organizations managing that time? Given that we can track attrition rates down, or we can, get airplane receipts down to 2 decimal places, yet we have very little idea of where 85+% of people's time is being spent and the effect on it for either positive outcomes or the drains in terms of either health, well-being, other things like that as well. So when I'm introducing these ideas, one of the common questions I get, and I'm sure it's in this audience, is active better than passive data sources? And I could care less. I use both of them. That should not be the question you're thinking about right now. We're kind of pigeoning me as a survey guy and somebody else as an email guy. It should be, what's the right data feed that helps us start getting traction on this? And there's strengths to both sides, using digital exhaust or using things where people can actually rate the effectiveness of a tie. And what I want to come into here is processes that we've used to apply the network analytic ideas, whether it's to digital exhaust, whether it's co-citation analytics, whether it's CRM data, whether it's survey, to getting those ideas to a format that actually has impact on what people are doing. So if I were to put a challenge to this field that I think will affect everybody in this room, is most of the traditional social network analysis metrics have been, unfortunately, designed by sociologists and others. They're great for scientific proofs in academic settings, but they're horrible in terms of actually driving action in organizations. And so you have to learn to pivot the data in different ways to get to representations that people can actually see and know what to do with, okay? So that's the journey I want to go on with you, and I want to see if we can do it in, let's see, this is not advancing for me, there we go. I want to do it in 2 different lights. One is, if you could take an X-ray or a snapshot into a group you care about and get a sense of who's interacting with whom, I want to think a little bit about what does that set of insights give you that you're not able to capture just looking at traditional human capital analytics. And secondarily, where are the value-added points in these networks? Not can you represent them in diagrams or things, but where are the value-added points that you want to actually have impact on? And then if we have time, I want to drop down at the second part of the discussion and think a little bit about what have we learned about the individual level outcomes too. So when we've been looking at high performers, what's unique about how they're connecting in different ways? And we'll hopefully have time to delve into that to be able to see some of the cool things there around the overload ideas. Now, this is an example drawn from my first book 20 years ago when I first started this stuff, running a research group at IBM, but I want to use it just as a way to get our conversation started, and then we'll go in whatever direction we want in terms of depth of granularity on the analytics or other things like that. The real case in this scenario group was losing about $750 million a year in their deep sea drilling area because they couldn't move best practices well. I was at IBM at the time, so we'd thrown technologies at it right and left, and it was having zero impact on them being able to kind of close the gap between their most efficient platforms and their least efficient. And so they came and said, could we do a network analysis? Could we see who's interacting with whom and take an x-ray, in essence, of this group? Now, real group is about 7,000 people, so I'm not starting with a big analytic hairball and exercise. I just want to start with a high-level representation of the kinds of things we see when we've done this work over 20 years. So we've worked with over 300 organizations. We've run the analytics over 1,000 times in different places. But you get the idea. On the left is the formal structure, your left, and then on the right is the informal, where we're just mapping, in this case, a relationship between two people that's a positive information flow connection, right, in this case. So it's one or the other person says that this is a really critical source of information for me to get my work done. Does that make sense? We good? All right, turn to the person right next to you. This is going to be your new best friend for a few minutes. And I want you to pair up and tell me what you see. I want you to be able to discuss in a minute. What do you see in here that's unique when you're looking at the informal that you wouldn't pick up if just looking at the formal, okay? So you got 1 minute on this. I want you to give me a couple ideas. All right, we got it? So let me pull us back, and I just want to hear a few things from the group around things that start to pop. And if you don't volunteer, I'm going to come out and get you. So if you guys are hiding behind a laptop in the back there, I will outwait long, uncomfortable silences like nobody you've ever seen. So give me a couple ideas. What pops out for you? What do we got?
Hi. So when I look at Mayer's, his communication network doesn't really fit his direct reports.
Right. So that's a great observation, right? The leaders typically get one of these things, and their eyes usually are furtively dancing around because they want to be dead center, right, in these things. They don't say it that way, but that's always kind of what they want. And if you see that, that's a horrendous thing. That means one way or the other, that individual has created an over-reliance on themselves. It's a significant derailer for them. It's become the biggest derailer we see in terms of people falling out of the upwardly mobile category. And if they get to certain points of overload, the attrition rates around them go up as much as 200% because people can't get to them, especially certain tenure bands. So you never want to see that, right? And if you do see that, there's very specific things we focus on around how do you shift that collaborative demand out and off the individual, because you never get agile, right? How many people are focused on agile transformations right now? Every time I hear that, it's always the implicit idea is we need to cross certain silos better, right? Either functional or geography. And you never get agile if 3 to 5% of your people are accounting for 20 to 35% of the value add, right? If everything has to go up, no matter how many silos you get, if everything has to go through a small set of people, it doesn't work. No matter what your investments are in physical space, technologies, all the consulting fees that are going into this. So you've got to be thinking about different points in the network, right? You don't want to be dead center, but you also don't want Mara's to be as peripheral in this case. And if you looked at it carefully, you'd see that Mara's is connected to Mitchell and Avery. And then if you track Mitchell and Avery in the formal structure, you'd see that they come from the exploration division, right? And so the next question I'd ask is, well, where do you think Mara's came from? Where do you think he elevated from in the organization? And obviously it's the exploration area, right? And so this is a super simplified example that I'm just trying to use to get us started. But it's a really common derailer for leaders in your organization to rise or to go through some kind of transition and continue to hold with 60, 70% of their trusted ties back where they came from. Right? So right when they need to diversify what they think of as important, they have anchors in their thinking that doesn't mean they're going to get fired typically, but it does mean very significantly that they tend to fall off the upwardly mobile path. Right? And so you want to be able to help people think about where do we have biases or anchors around that. So Maris is one. What else do we see? Yep.
Hi. Well, first of all, I was thinking about we should give Michelle a raise, I guess.
Right. So Mitchell, how many people said raise and how many people said bottleneck? Just show of hands, raise on Mitchell, and show of hands, bottleneck. All right. So it's a really interesting question. You can't really look at this immediately and know which direction you want to go in, whether it's somebody that's doing a significant job or not. But you'd be really interested in the Mitchells of the world. And statistically, what we see in this is 3 to 5% of the people, and this really matters for you guys, so bear with me on this stat, 3 to 5% of the people account for 20 to 35% of the value-added collaborations in most places. So a really small set of people have a disproportionate influence on what's going on in the network. And if I compare my list against the company's list, so there's never one Mitchell. If I'm looking at 40,000 people, there could be thousands of them, right, distributed through the group. What we find is there's usually less than a 50% overlap between who the company's paying attention to and who's that kind of influencer in the network. Right? And so you obviously really, to your point, if Mitchell's playing a positive role, you want to make sure you know that because they're more likely to leave if they're not getting recognized in different ways. Or if it's an overload point, you want to think about how do we distribute that, right? What do we do on that front? Yeah.
Well, that was like more of a joke thing, but interesting point. What I was also interested was that Michelle is under Avery's leadership function, and out of all the leadership group, Avery has the more connection than the other leaders. So
right.
That impact of that leader to that group, showing up that Michelle is now such a big impact.
Right, right. So you'd be able to, you start to
index of leadership impact to that team.
Right, to pick up kind of different views of influence, both the formal leaders and what they're having, but also informal, right, influencers that you want to kind of engage. In this specific case, it turned out Mitchell just owned access to a certain database that everybody had to come to him for. And so, you know, real group, remember, 7,000 people. It was much more sophisticated analytically, but you could find pinch points this way in terms of poor role design, decision right allocation, other things that are kind of slowing things down in the network. And so that's always a really key thing that we're focused on as well. Anybody else? I saw one other hand go up there. Can't remember. You good? We got it? Okay.
I've got one, Rob.
Oh.
The reservoir and production team, their only connection into the rest of the network is through Mitchell.
Right. And so you kind of get different points where, you know, and this can happen in all sorts of different ways, but you're interested in where are you not getting good inclusion in the networks as well. We're always focused on the central points and seeing either talent that needs to be recognized, where overload is keeping us from being agile or responsive, or just opinion leaders. If you're trying to drive a change, you want Mitchell on the design team, for example, early. Just as much I'm interested in the fringe, and what we see analytically is, for example, it can be functions that aren't well integrated if you're going through a merger integration, right? A lot of times you're very interested in how do you slingshot those people in. Analytically, what we see is newcomers like a Sutherland, for example. It typically takes about 3 to 5 years for those people to come in the organization and replicate the connectivity of a high performer. It doesn't mean they don't have connections for the first couple of years, but it means that it takes a long time to build that profile of legitimacy and bridging ties that distinguishes the people that are outperforming. Now, what's interesting about this is we also, every time we do this, we find people that are what I call fast movers. They get much more connected than their peer group much more rapidly. They're really subtle things they're doing in terms of early staffing, the way they interact with the group that slingshots them in and gets them in about 9 months, right? And so we have a real big group in my consortium. We have 40 companies that are going to be meeting at Amazon literally Monday, focused on how do you do that, right? How do you help kind of take this invisible fabric of the organization, take it seriously in ways that get people productive more quickly and also decrease attrition. So I want to come back to that in a moment and give a few thoughts on that. And then you'd also be interested in silos, right? And for me, I'm never, ever coming back into these things saying you want everybody connected to everybody else, right? Because if I asked how many of you all wanted another email meeting or phone call in your lives, there's never any hands that go up, unless you're the new person trying to figure out how it gets done. But you know, what you are interested is really in two ideas. One is where are the collaborative breakdowns happening that are decreasing our ability to get scale, right? People doing similar kinds of work not connecting, and there's an economic value then you can attribute to getting that subset of networks connected. Or where are we missing kind of go-to-market potential, right? Groups that should be collaborating that could either drive innovation, drive more holistic solutions to the client, things like that. In this case, literally, this group had moved up 2 floors in the building before we'd come down to run the analysis, and that physical separation of just a couple of floors had broken down all the hallway interactions they'd been using to coordinate. It sounds silly, but high fixed asset cost structure. You know, they were spending about $400,000 a day each platform to get to oil, so 400,000 times 9 platforms around the world. Those delays were hugely expensive, right, when they couldn't kind of get decisions made in there. So what you're always looking for in this game is not can you generate a diagram, right, or not can you go out and get Wasserman and Faust or the other books that are very academic around what metrics do the social network people apply, because generally they're good for scientific purposes, but they're not necessarily good for building a business case. or for really helping you see that it's not a structural whole that matters, it's actually 5 kinds of connections that we can teach people to build when they come in. And then you also want to be thinking about what's the business case, right? And so if I can come into an organization and say, look, I can drop attrition by 2%, as an example, by paying attention to the invisible fabric that we haven't been looking at, that's a big business case, right? Or if I can come in and say, if we can streamline the decision-making in a high fixed asset cost structure where you're spending millions of dollars a day, that's XYZ. Or if you can go in and say, we can replicate what your high revenue producers do, right? And if you could get the next 20% revenue producers to mirror the networks of the most productive, that's a big business case. You know what I mean? And so you want to be kind of thinking about it if you're building ideas around this in those terms. What you do not want to do, and I've learned this over the years so many times, anybody that gets excited about the diagrams, I used to just love those people, right? Because I would say, we're going to have a project together. And 9 times out of 10, they had no idea why they were excited, and they had no kind of outcomes, in mind. And so you get into the project, and you're just mining data, looking for, what do we go do with this stuff? And that's the very last place you want to be, right? You want to have a real clear business case up front, real clear reason for why the analytics are likely to matter, and then a real clear way to then drive an intervention off the back end, right? To have things that you can go do about it. And when you do that, it's a home run because it's completely new data. People aren't used to seeing this. They know it matters. Ask them how much time they spend on the phone, on email, or in meetings, and they roll their eyes. And if you can give them traction on that, then you have really good uptake. This thing is killing me. I don't know why it was working earlier. So what I want to go to with this, and I want to put something back to you all, is when we look at these networks, when I'm looking to see what do the high-performing units do in an organization, or if I'm in a place where I can have like similar kinds of like stores or branch banks or just bunches of teams that are similar sizes, one of the things we've been very interested in is looking at that unit-level performance, not as a product of the human capital that's on the team or in the unit, but as a product of the network that forms inside and outside of that team, right? So Google got a lot of traction with like the psychological safety stuff on teams. When they're looking at it as an aggregate metric in that team, the reality is it's not so much the team members and the composition of the team members that drive the result. It's the pattern of connectivity that forms inside and outside of the group, right? That's going to deliver the result if you kind of dig into it from a network standpoint. So if we take that view, then there tend to be 4 points that matter from a performance implication standpoint in any of the networks we're looking at. One is, are you doing things that get better leverage in the center of the network? And that means to me 2 kinds of people. One is, are you being aware of where you have people that are having a disproportionate effect in the network but are not getting recognized in different ways. So the attrition rates of that group is phenomenal. If it happens to be Mitchells of the world and you lose them, then the inefficiencies that happen around that are really significant. People come back together, they figure out how to regroup in different ways, but if you can avoid that, you definitely want to do that. And then second is, where do we have overload happening? Where do we have a small set of people that are just flat out overwhelmed and individually burning out, attrition rates around them potentially higher? There's all sorts of kind of negative consequences of that. The way we look at that is not with the diagrams. So this is one of all sorts of views that we've learned to kind of build out that helps people get a very specific analytic footprint of what's going on in the group. So this happens to be a very rapid survey-based tool we use at the team level. It takes about leaders in the consortia that I run, organizations, about 10 minutes to set it up. They can deploy it in groups of 30 to 120 or 50 or whatever, and they can come back and get different insights on who's interacting with whom. And so this gives you a sense of the overall incoming ties, meaning the number of times that somebody relies on that individual. It tells you who's most influential is Vernell in this case. We will then, as you look across here, often marry it with the HR systems or whatever metric they're looking at that says, is this person considered a top performer, right? And so what you always get when you're looking down these lists is that leaders will have picked and identified the top performers, maybe the top 3, 4, 5 connectors right, but then they start having surprises, like people that passed over for promotion, other things like that. So you're always interested in the no's here, right, in this column, because they're much more likely to leave if you're not recognizing them. And if you have a bunch of them, you want to be thinking carefully about the degree to which that can have impact on you. Now, I have gotten into the habit, whenever it's survey-based, and this is one of the things that makes email tricky initially, but there's strengths to email as well if you're doing it over time, like in merger integration. We use it a lot that way. I've really gotten in the habit of always asking questions that has some sort of emotional dimension in every assessment we do. And usually it's positive, so this idea of energy, been mapping for 22 years. It is statistically outpredicts high performers at a level I've never seen in anything else. It's a huge, huge predictor of high performers. And so what this is showing is the degree to which people that are in, for example, Vernell's network also say he's an energizer. Right? When I interact with him, I walk away feeling a little bit better. Right? I'm more enthused about what I'm up to. And so he turns out to be not a huge energizer. It doesn't mean he's a de-energizer. It doesn't mean negative. It just means it is kind of the absence of the positive, if you will. And it turned out he was a patent attorney within the group, and so that kind of made sense, you know, in the role that you have there. But when you start to be able to see this, you can think about who are the people that might be succession candidates, right? Not as the only screen. You're definitely looking to see what other elements are they bringing in terms of capability, experience. But if you can also lay over something that says this person has the right network to make them successful at this next level, or if they don't, what do we need to do to build it, right? To kind of get, you know, people into that place. It's a big deal. Energy for me is not a froofy idea. It's something we've been studying literally for 22 years. It boils down to about 9 specific behaviors these people do. So it's very coachable, right? When you see people that aren't necessarily hitting on the high side of that. So we're always looking at a positive side. Some of the more cool things I'm doing right now, people have started to let me see the negative side in these relationships. I had one guy, 6,500 person group, they let me map fear in the organization. So imagine that, right? You know, they came to me and they said, we have a culture of fear here. And you're like, oh dear God, right? What do you do with that? You know, good luck and look at the time. And I said, well, could we map it, right? Could we actually see who are the people that are generating, not so much physically am I scared of you, but I tend to hold back ideas, right? I don't tend to bring something forward until it's perfected. And so we did that. And what was amazing about it is you go from this idea of having a culture of fear in an organization and thinking, what do you do, to actually seeing where it's being generated in the group, right? And so it boils it down to saying, okay, it's not so much a culture of fear, it's 40 leaders that are just not leading well, right? They're too dictatorial in what they're doing. There's about 50 experts that are trying to preserve their status in the situation, and so they're not good in terms of how they're engaging others. And there was about 50 scared people, right? They weren't generating the fear per se, but they were scared of everything, and they were just as bad because they propagated, you know, what wasn't there. And when you can see that, you can get down a layer into how do you shift that, right? It makes it much more targeted in ways that help us kind of drive culture. One of the biggest programs of work we have going on in the consortia right now is on this idea of cultural agility. And what I've been finding, and I'd be interested to compare notes with people, is the cultural surveys, the engagement surveys that go out, and without offending anybody, oftentimes are very misleading because you come back with averages in areas, right? You come back with, say, a 4 in a given area or geography or something like that. When you overlay those scores on the network, what you find are very, very infrequently is it actually an average. You know, it's not typically a 4, it's actually pockets of 3s and 5s. So you have some leaders that are doing things that create this really vibrant context around them and others that may not be. And that is really helpful to see, right? It starts to say, okay, here's how we need to target things differently to kind of raise either people's propensity towards a value or to raise engagement or things like that. So it's a cool tool to combine with some of the other analytics out there because it really is, in our world, showing that culture is much more local. Our experience of companies is much more local than some of these kind of aggregate measures start to put out there. So energy, always interested. And then the other thing for me that I'm always focused on is where do we have overload happening? So I have a way of looking at this analytically that focuses on the degree to which somebody's heavily sought out, and if others are saying we need more of their time, then when that threshold, that percentage of threshold passes about 25%, we see that those people start burning out and the people around them start leaving at alarming rates, right? And so when you see that, you're really interested in how do we, systematically drive that down? And I'm going to come back to a couple ideas on that as we go. So you get the idea that this is a way of looking at the influencers and networks in a more nuanced way, right? The typical thing that people will come to me constantly, I was just at, I'm not going to mention the name of the place, but all we want to know is who the influencers are. And if we can find the influencers, we can drive cultural change. Well, that doesn't acknowledge the fact that half your influencers are so overwhelmed already that if you just put them on the next thing without finding ways to take off some of the demands, you're going to kill it. Or if I look at all the companies in my consortia that are moving to Agile right now, they end up really in gridlock because they staff these Scrum teams with the people that are top of mind, right, in the HR systems or reputation-wise. If you do that, inevitably you're grabbing the overwhelmed people, right? They're the ones that are going to be, top of mind. So what you end up doing is you take the most busy people out of existing work streams and you put them over in these Scrum teams that disrupts the workflow over here, and it obviously those networks don't stop coming to the individual, right? They have to still be able to get there to solve problems, so it overloads the person over, on the other side. The idea is not, if you go back, it's not to go back and say, don't do Agile. Rob said, don't do Agile. It's not at all it. But the idea is use the analytics to pick your second-tier connectors, right? So that you're not kind of taking the most busy people and putting them over there and imbalancing the system even more. You're actually taking kind of people that could be from a developmental opportunity and finding ways to kind of shift the overall collaborative demand in the system. When we see people do that, you get really good success. But you have to have the analytics, right, behind it. You can't be guessing because we're woefully inaccurate on this stuff. And so what I would be thinking about is, again, whether it's active or passive, I could care less. But do you have representations of this? Do you have representations of the relational aspect of how work is getting done? Remember, again, at what percentage most people's butts hit the seat was about 85%. So if you're not kind of factoring that into your models of what's going on, the relational side of work, then you're missing really significant components, right, that can help in different ways. All right, I want to show you one more thing, then I'm going to put you back to work for me. So when I look at groups, it can be a team of 8, it could be the top layers of an organization, it could be the whole organization, it could be a unit. However we're parsing it, when I apply this lens, I'm always interested in 4 points at least. One is the center, right, the overloaded or the under-recognized. Second is the fringe, and for me this can be just capabilities that are less utilized. It could be merger integrations not happening well. It could be geographies, right? Just distant geographies that we're kind of thinking about. A really big one for me, though, is always the newcomers. So any organization that is in a growth phase or kind of hiring a lot, they really struggle getting integration and maintaining cultural values in there. Again, what we've seen is that it takes about 3 to 5 years if you just let it happen randomly in most places. And this is it's not just a stat I'm throwing off on one study. This is 20 years of work, 300 organizations, 1,000 times we've done the analytics. It persistently shows out, especially in strong culture organizations, that it takes about that long to replicate the connectivity of a high performer. One of the pieces of work we've done, though, has been very focused on getting big data sets, so 40, 50,000 people, and then getting monthly attrition data off of that, right? And what we focused on then was saying, what are the people that come in, get connected much more quickly than their peers, and also don't leave, right, in that entry phase? Because the idea usually is if you can keep them 90 days, and then if you can keep them past 5 years, right, you tend to hold on to them for a long time, depending on the organizations and the timelines. So what we were doing there is looking to say, those people that come in, get productive quickly, and don't leave, what's the network they're forming, right, on entry, and then especially the course of the first year. The mistake people make a lot of times is they assume entry is done at 90 days, right? And they're not investing in ways to kind of build connectivity that has a big impact, particularly at month 9, month 10 in there. And we learned a bunch of really cool things. So as an example, on entry, it isn't a big network that you need, right? In fact, never does performance get predicted by a big network in this game. There's a much more nuance kind of behind it in terms of what's going on. On entry, you need a decent-sized network, but the interesting thing about it is it's not reaching, it's being sought that matters, right? Because we can see the directionality in there. So you say, well, why does that matter? Well, most of the companies, that probably yours as well, you come in the organization, they say, go tell people what you do, right? Or go build your brand. And some of them even teach executive narrative storytelling techniques so they can go tell their story even better, right? And intuitively, that's kind of the last thing that people want to hear from a newcomer is how they've done it before and what they've done before. It actually pushes them away in strong culture places. What we see, the more successful people that slingshot in very rapidly, they are going out early and either through their leader or intuitively, they're finding the Mitchells of the world. They're asking a ton of questions and then slowly morphing what they know to the incumbent's needs. They're giving status, generating energy in the interaction, creating a mutual win. And by virtue of that, they get pulled in, right, by the influencers. They ride on the legitimacy of the established people and they get pulled into opportunities. Has a hugely different effect to be doing that versus going out and telling people what you do, right, or what you know. And our tendency to oversell ourselves when we're under risk is unbelievable. Our tendency is immediately to jump into sales mode when we're new to a place. And what we're finding is if you can teach people to do it the reverse way, and then the top companies in my consortia actually have the Mitchells of the world reaching to the newcomers, right? They have the analytics in place so that if a newcomer is failing, the typical thing is, oh, they weren't Apple, or they weren't Google, or they weren't Goldman, or whatever. Never did they ask the question, what have we done not to bring that person in, right? And if you have the analytics, you can start saying, are we doing the right pairings early? And you can have a really big effect there. So with some of the work, as an example, we found that on entry, it was creating pull versus push that mattered, getting to network influencers, and then forming similar tenure ties so that people have a cohort of others that they can turn to. And then that network shifts over the course of the entry period. So what most companies in the consortia are doing, and then the big meeting we'll have on Monday, is focused on that trajectory of a first year of experience. If we can get people through the first year and drop the attrition rates, what connectivity matters at what point, right? What do they need to be doing and what kinds of ties matter? And then building programs around that are feeding these ideas in. So second thing for me from an analytics standpoint is, number one, if you do this in your organizations, get off the diagrams within 2 minutes. Use them for fireworks, whatever you need to do to get people excited and move stuff around. But get off of that very quickly, and then the more you can hide the analytics and embed it in a process or something like that, you get much greater effect. So what I've been seeing with the Commons members is that they will build programs over the course of the first year where there are either behavioral nudges going to these people and their leader to say this kind of connection matters now, or there are other devices, staffing in certain ways that helps build that connectivity. And they've had good success. This is early stages for us, but the couple that have taken this more seriously have seen attrition rates go down in a way that's not insignificant. And it's a product of, number one, analytically knowing what relationship matters at what point, and then building mechanisms, right, that create that. Not giving people the data to try and figure it out, but kind of embedding it in the system of activity. And for me, and this is a little bit of what I meant, what I've learned in this is, the social network software and existing metrics that are out there and the analytic tools, they will talk about structural holes and all these other analytics that mean absolutely nothing to an executive. And what I found is you've got to back away and say, it's not the metrics that the social network researchers are using, but the metrics that kind of help us be able to get action on things. So this is a real simple tool. It's one of 12 ideas that we know matter on entry, is that people surge into a broad network early. That network is much more broad than most people realize. If you're just looking at like the first 90 days work or something like that. And you want to be able to get to categories like this, right? To say, okay, it's these 5 categories in this table. I'm sorry it's small like this, but this is on my website. And here's why these people matter. If you can get to that level, this is something a newcomer can sit down with their leader and say, what do I need to go do, right? And you can be at a point where action is being taken on it. And that's where, I've always focused with my consortia, is to get the ideas into, a more consumable format so that action can be driven off of it. So, the reason I say this, if you're looking at groups you care about, your entire organization, teams, whatever it may be, usually what we see is that the points of value are not just on the silos, right? From a collaborative standpoint, that's what everybody grabs hold of, is thinking about how do we get different kinds of people connected for innovation or cross geography, connections. It definitely exists there. It's definitely a point you're targeting, but you also have to be focused on, does overload exist on the center? Are we getting rapid inclusion from the fringe, right? And are we doing things that create agility in terms of transparency of expertise, so those groups surge to opportunities, and in terms of external ties? And so we've looked at this these different networks and groups we care about. We see that these points always predict the more successful groups in organizations. And then with I4CP recently, we ran these 8 dimensions, eight questions into a cross-industry survey. And we found that 7 of the 8 also predicted market return in those organizations. So one of the strategies I've taken in all of this is to say, okay, we can run the network analyses in certain places, and that can be great. But in some instances, like leadership programs or other things, they're just not going to go out and do that. So how do we kind of back away and get to dimensions that we can get those leaders to pay attention to, right? And these are 8 ideas that are very consistent predictors of more successful groups. That make sense where we are? Yeah? All right, your same best friend right next to you. I want you to give me 1 minute of thought and tell me, what does your organization do well on this? Pick one of these things. Are you good at getting people in from the edge, good at crossing silos? I don't care what it is. Pick one. And then number 2, what do you not do well? Right? What if you spent or invested time in could have a big impact in your organization? Got to pair up, talk about this with somebody, and then we'll kind of bounce this idea around for a second. We good? All right, let me pull you back. And what I'm just trying to seed, in general, is the idea that work is getting done collaboratively. And a ton of decisions are being made, whether it's spans and layers, agile, talent decisions, cultural change programs. Tons of decisions are made with the idea that we want to be a networked organization, but not actually measuring the work, right, and seeing what's happening in different ways. So whether you get it through email, digital exhaust, survey, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? At the heart of it, it doesn't matter, because they're going to show you similar kinds of things. Some have strengths over others, depending on the nature of the opportunity. But you really want to find ways to get representations of this data out there, to have people thinking about decisions and what they're doing. Question came up around what is the tie in this? So that's kind of the core of it. It could be frequency of email exchanges. I struggle with that in what I do at the levels that I get to, because there could be 50 emails you and I exchange fighting over a travel approval that have nothing to do with the deal that's getting won. Where I get great traction on email is if you're looking at change over time. So if you're looking at entry, for example, and seeing if people are entering and transitioning well and not falling into traps, great use of it, right? Or if you're looking at merger integration, you may start with a scaled assessment so you can pick up qualitative aspects of the data, and then you go to monthly email polls or things like that. Great use of it, right? So again, it's kind of not one or the other. Typically, it's picking the right tool for the right point in what you're trying to solve. This is a simple tool that we have in the consortia. I'll give you kind of a real quick sense of one thing that I've been focused on building these ideas out at a team level, because what I always get hit with is members in my consortia will come to me and sometimes they're saying, we want to look at the top 10,000 people, right? And those are easy studies to run. They're strategic studies. You go out, you design the assessment, you run the analytics, but it's more of a consulting project, right? Over the years, I've had a ton of people come to me and say, we've got this group of 100, right? Or this group of 30, or these 18 teams of 10 that aren't integrating well. And it becomes difficult to kind of target that level, that kind of mid-tier level with a full-on kind of consulting study or a big software, things like that. So one of the things we've built for the consortia is this team-level analytic tool. And I'm going to use the word team, but I could be talking about groups ranging from 8 to 300, right, where people are kind of overusing that term in different ways. And the idea with this one, and it's one of many we built out, is that the members, if they have a leader that wants to see what does my group of 64 look like, it's really prescriptive, right? They're not able to make a bunch of decisions on different kinds of network questions they're mapping or things. It's the 3 that we typically see work. And they go in and invite their team into it. I won't kind of bore you with a dashboard that this takes to enable people to be more successful, but they go in and invite their team in to take it, and then they can knock out a network analysis very quickly. 2 weeks out, it comes back. This is all formatted. What I've focused on with the group are, number 1, understanding the collaborative practices. So these 8 points that we just talked about that matter, we know matter in pretty much any group performance. But the idea for me is always closing the loop between what is the analytics saying and then what's the opportunity. So in this case, the group, this is real data mocked up just to be able to show it. But in this case, the group is saying we don't deal with the external environment as well as we should. And this has been hugely eye-opening for me in the work we're doing right now. We're looking at successful team leaders across 20 top organizations. And we're finding that around 60 to 65% of their time is spent shaping the ecosystem in which that team sits. It's not just the internal stuff to the team. And that's a real difference from a lot of the team development methodologies. A lot of it's focused internally. And what these people are saying is you're missing, different opportunity points there. So for me, it's always important to be able to get the, to get the analytics kind of built out in a way that is then feeding an action to, in this case, the team member, right, the decision maker. And then we also give them the ability to look at the network itself. And so just to give a flavor of what you can do with any number of tools out there, this is the work-related information. I'm going to pop out the nose and just kind of look at the positive collaboration. This is, we'll look at it by function. I'm going to knock out one just to make it a little easier to see. And then you can look quickly, right, and see how is this group collaborating. If you're a leader of this group, obviously you all are looking at this analytically. Excuse me, it's lines and arrows of people you don't know or care about, but if it's your group, you start thinking about where are things kind of over-connected, under-connected, things like that. The key in this for me is not the diagramming or the other analytics, like I've been saying, because anybody can do this. The key for me is then building, helping that leader see what points do you need to pay attention to. So anybody can run the diagrams, right? But the key is to find out where the value-added points are. And so what we're focused a lot on is building tools for the Commons members that help them say, okay, you as a leader that's new to this, you care about your most connected people, right? So I'm going to click this button, and you see when I do that, it drops down the people that are most influential, that are absorbing most ties, and then it gives recommendations, right, around what do you need to be thinking about with those people. I could go to the least connected. It was going to give me a different list if we do that. The top integrators, if you're trying to bring a merger in, the people that are going to play the most productive role there. I won't bore you with kind of all the specific things in there, and my intent is not to be doing a software demo, but rather to get to drive the point home that if you start doing this stuff, don't just run the diagrams. The number of times I come into places and people, because they've come out of some PhD program, they run the analysis and then there's no implications off of it. And then people come and say, oh, network analysis doesn't work. And it's like, no, you used a hammer on a violin, right? You didn't have specific kind of points that you were trying to focus on. And so you want to start with that kind of in mind, right? And have kind of clear implications of what you're going to do on the back end. All right. We good? Okay? All right. A couple more minutes. I want to drive a little bit into the individual stuff and get you moving one more time to make sure, I can see your blood sugars falling like my hairline right out there. So I'm going to keep you with me. So 22 years, one of the other things I've been really interested in is predicting the high performers in places, right? And so when I say a successful person, it has been for 20 years where we'll run the analytics and I'll get performance data from that organization. It could be any number of forms. It could be ratings, it could be revenue production, patent counts, whatever they give us that's viable, and then seeing what's unique about how those top 20% performers are engaging, right? How are they building a network that distinguishes them over time? And then more recently, and what I loved, Al, about what you were saying is I've been very focused on always been focusing on are you in and staying in the upwardly mobile trajectory, but over about the past decade, I've been really interested in are you scoring high on measures of thriving or resilience, just physical well-being metrics, if we happen to be able to capture some of that. So the idea for me is I'm calling somebody successful if they're performing well and sustainable, right, at what they're doing. They're not this close to killing people, right, or themselves around them. And what we're learning about that is, this will be the basis of my next book, is that it's never a big network. Usually there's a negative relationship between just knowing a lot of people and likelihood of continued success over time. A lot of times that big network strategy introduces a couple of kinds of derailers that we don't have time to delve into. But what we're learning in this is that the more successful people, they tend to be operating in this kind of infinity loop representation. And so on one side, they are engaging in ways that enable them to be about 18 to 24% more efficient collaboratively. So imagine, me running all these analytics for the past 10 years, where we'll scatter plot out the people that give the greatest impact in groups and take the least amount of time, right? And so we're really interested in what those people are doing. I call them my efficient collaborators, and they're the ones you want to emulate, right? Not the other quadrant, the people that you see them coming and you know there goes an hour of your life you'll never get back, right? Or they organize a meeting. If it should be a half an hour, they'll make it 2 hours. And we're not interested in them, right? We're just interested in saying, what are the efficient collaborators doing? And so we started looking at those people. I went out and interviewed 100 women, 100 men that fell into that category, and then we built a range of diagnostics for the consortia that's put this stuff into survey-based approaches. And the basic idea that you find is that the more successful people, they're not doing one thing. It's not, one or two big things that enable them to claw back about 18 to 24% of their time. And this is a constant struggle for me, because when I write for HBR or Wall Street Journal or other places, they always want one thing, right? What's the one simple thing that everybody could go do? And I could present it that way. I could say you need North Star clarity, you need a couple of these sexy ideas that are in there. But whenever I'm in a room like this, and a lot of times I'll use these card sort activities, or we have an online tool that lets you kind of think about what do you need to do. People never pick the same thing, right? I'll walk around the room and I'll say, if there are 8 practices around how you put structure into your world differently that these more efficient collaborators do, nobody's ever picking the same thing. In fact, if we polled in this room, you'd see it's almost always an even distribution across those 8. So the strategy for me in this has been not how do I identify the biggest statistical predictor, because I could do that, right, with beta weights, but then I would miss 80% of the room, right, in terms of what you needed to do, right, to get better given your role or other things that are happening. The strategy in this for me is to be able to identify the broad practices and then create funnels that get you down to year 3, right, that you need to be paying attention to. And it's working really well in places. And if you kind of go after things a little bit differently, not look for the biggest beta weights, but kind of go after it a little bit more uniquely, it has a big impact. And so what we find is the people that do better, they're more likely to put structure into their work differently. One of the reasons so many of the time management books fail is because they assume that people are atoms. And if I make a decision to not do email at a certain point, that's my decision, when half the time it isn't, right? It's stuff that's coming at you in different ways. And so they're doing things that put structure in. They strategically calendar on Friday night or Sunday night. They block reflective time. They just do a set of things that kind of buffer, right, on that front. They do things that kind of challenge what I'll call an identity trigger in this, or a belief. So I came into the overload stuff, I was completely convinced the enemy was out there, right? It was emails, time zones, nasty bosses, and demanding clients. I was absolutely sure that was all that drove it. Completely came out the other end knowing that 50% of it is us and how we are conditioned to think we need to insert ourselves in different ways. And what I've learned in this is some of us do it because we love to help, right? It's a knee-jerk reaction. Some because we're scared of missing out or just of being perceived as a poor colleague. Some because we love status, And so what you're looking for in that is what's your trigger? Right? The last time you jumped into something, you had discretionary effort not to. You jumped in anyway, and then 6 weeks later, you're going, how the hell did I get here again? Right? That's what you're looking for, is that kind of knee-jerk trigger in there. And then the third are behavioral pieces, right? So we find, for example, that it's not actually email that's killing us. It's the culture of use that we allow to persist around it in what we can control. It's not meetings that kill us. It's a lack of discipline before, during, and after, and practices that we can actually influence in different ways. And what we're finding is that people kind of go in and adapt one idea from each of these areas. They are able to buy time back. So the cover that Al put up earlier, you can pull that HBR down, and we've built a diagnostic that you can go out and use. I make this stuff available to everybody for free just to get these ideas out there. But it's a real easy way to go in and see what are the 1 or 2 things I need to do. Then the question is, and this is the last thing I'll put to you, what do you do with the freed time, right? Do you just go about the same activities faster, or do you find ways to get scale around yourself? And what we're finding is that the more successful people, it's a broad network, which we've always known is the second biggest predictor of a high performer. What we hadn't known until more recently is it's early stage problem solving. So right when you've got 8 things going on, the 9th lands, that's the time to be reaching out. And if you have not done some things that buy back 18 to 24% of your time, that's the stuff you stop doing. You stop being exploratory early stage because you're redlined, right? If you have bought back time and you're reaching out, what that enables you to do ultimately is to solve bigger things, involve more people, build a broader reputation than people that aren't doing that. Right? It doesn't mean the people that aren't doing it get fired, but it means that you'll distinguish over time by virtue of the connectivity strategy there. And then the final thing, this is what I want to make sure I want to end on, I won't have time to go into the renewal side of it, is this idea of, do you create pull for yourself? And so I find over 20 years of doing this that the biggest predictor from a network standpoint is not reaching to predict a performer, it's actually being sought, right? And we find that these people that I call energizers, that create enthusiasm around them, they win at a huge rate. Typically the beta weights, when I'm predicting a high performer on this energy dimension, is about 4 times the predictor of a high performer as anything else we've seen. And it's very behavioral, right? It's not charisma, it's not extroversion. Likely to see a low key as a high key person be an energizer. So it's stuff that you can teach and adapt over time. So I want to end on this idea and make it a little bit more personal for you. So you got to stand up and make eye contact with somebody in this room you've not been speaking with so far. You got to stand up, pair up, make eye contact with somebody you haven't been speaking with. It usually works much better than me screaming. So I want you to, one of you become A, the other become B. So figure that out quietly and quickly for me, because I only got a couple minutes here. You got A, become B. And I'm going to tell you 2 things. One is I'm going to give you guys about an A-. You did pretty well in here. And by that, what I mean is typically I'll do this in audiences. I've just finished saying it's a broad network early stage problem solving, and usually have a little bit more time to delve into what I mean there. I will get people to stand up, and 90% of the time, the men go to the men, the women go to the women, and you actually find similar height people, seek out similar height people in the room, and you see a little bit of that in evidence here. But it's just a constant reminder of our tendency, early stage, when we're under risk, when something's ambiguous, we look for similarity, right? And sometimes it's tacit, sometimes it's just people we rely on, and that's not what you need to do. Right, that's the point that you really need to be breaking frames and thinking a little bit more broadly. But you guys did pretty well, so I'm not going to mix you up. But here's what I am going to do. I want A, in 10 seconds, I want you to think about this for a second, to be ready to tell B something that you were really excited about in your work in the coming 6 months in your organization. I don't want you to go until I say go, but I want you to get something in your mind that you're really excited about in the coming 6 months in your organization. Now, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, go, and you have to go no matter what. When I say 1, 2, 3, go, B, your job is to be as humanly disinterested as possible. You just could flat out care less. 1, 2, 3, go. All right. Okay, I'll put you out of your misery. Let me draw you back here. So if you're A, you get the idea, right, behind this, that it is impossible to be energized in the context of somebody that doesn't care, right, at the heart of it. And if you're me, you learn a lot about people in this game, because some of you enjoy that way too much, the Bs that are out there, and so the coffee cup's going up. And if I'm on Wall Street, of course, that's really aggressive. They're walking out the door and people are chasing them. But when I say an energizer, this is something that I've been at literally for 22 years, and it significantly outpredicts everything else we've seen. And you don't see that very often. It's easy to create big effects in lab studies, like psychological studies and things like that. It's really rare to get such persistent effects over 20 plus years in live situations. But we generally find that if you are an energizer, if you can say, I create enthusiasm around me, and be right, other people think the same things you do, then that's about 4 times the predictor of a high performer as anything else we've seen. And to me, the cool part about it is it's not extroversion or introversion, for example. You're as likely to see a strong extrovert as introvert be considered a strong energizer. It is about being fully present, right, in the moment, right? And so if you're sitting there and somebody's with you and you're constantly down in your computer or in your text, that's an example of not being present, right? And it indexes the importance of that person, and it comes back and has an effect over time. The people that are more likely to stay there, they create pull. The reason the energizers win for me, this is one of 9 behaviors that we see distinguish them, none of which are impossible to learn, right? I constantly get this question of, are energizers is that just who they are? And it's not the case at all. But what you're trying to do is to get to those specific things that you can kind of alter, right? And last thing I'll say is it's really worth thinking about in terms of the negatives. right? So everybody's got people in their mind that you think of that you're thinking, oh my God, they kill me. And what we see is the negative has more than twice the negative impact as the positive has positive, right? That's a common finding, plays out in this stuff too. For 20 years, I've been completely convinced that the de-energizers were born and not made, right? In essence, that's just how God put them on the earth. And what we found, I had somebody from Harvard come over and look at this stuff in a lot of depth, is that 90+% of the time, the strong de-energizers at time period 10 didn't start that way, right? They started out kind of positive, and then a couple things went wrong, right? And so what you're looking for is not just, what one or two things do I need to do differently, but how do you kind of coach people, right? If you see that trajectory happening, and what can you do to reverse it? Okay. So real quick pass through, obviously, but I really wanted to kind of share a couple ideas at the group level. What do we see that matters in this stuff, and how do you think about it from a standpoint where you're delivering value back? And then at the individual level too, there's a tremendous amount you can do in terms of influencing leadership programs, transition efforts, all sorts of things that happen kind of at that level too that can have a big impact. So with that, I will say thank you very much for the chance to be here.